Good morning, everybody. I am here at the UN building in New York City with Dr. Rhys from the University of Glasgow. And, well, what are we doing here, Rhys? What are we doing at the UN building in New York?
So we're at the third meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So this is the third time that states who have signed the treaty have met at the UN to discuss their obligations and how to ensure that the treaty is implemented and succeeds with the states that have signed up to it.
As I understand it, we're on the verge or the majority of the world's nations have signed this treaty.
So yeah, we're one signatory away from having a majority of UN member states sign up to the treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, basically.
Yeah, so big steps forward, hopefully, anyway, will come out of this treaty. And you have been holding an event here on Monday. Can you tell us briefly what was that about?
So yeah, at the University of Glasgow, my colleague Dr. Carolina and I are working on a big project called Atomic Anxiety in the New Nuclear Age, where we're looking at the development of this new nuclear era, and we're looking at changes in global politics and what they mean for things like nuclear arms control and disarmament. So we had a side event where we talked about a working paper that we submitted, presented findings, and presented a couple of ideas for what we think states parties need to do to ensure that the treaty can succeed.
Yeah, so as I understand it, it's this third nuclear age, the idea that we've entered a new era in terms of nuclear weapons in the world. Can you explain what that means? What were the first two ages? Why are we in a third one?
Yeah, so this concept of the third nuclear age basically encapsulates this idea that things are new. You might have heard it in the news referred to as the new nuclear age or the third nuclear age, and we've seen government officials from both the UK and the US use this term and say, hey, things are different now, we're in a new nuclear era or a third nuclear age, and we need to therefore change our nuclear policies, whether that's modernising nuclear warheads or increasing stockpiles of them and things like that. So the third nuclear age follows the first and second nuclear ages. The first covered the Cold War era, where the kind of key characteristic was bipolar superpower competition and an arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. With the end of the Cold War, we see the start of the second nuclear age, where the key concerns are different. And there's denuclearization, there's a reduction in the total number of nuclear weapons that exist, but there's proliferation to other states. India and Pakistan test nuclear weapons in the 90s and they get the bomb, and there's fears about rogue states and nuclear terrorism in the context of the global war on terror. So the third nuclear age is different, and that begins, I argue, at least in 2019 with the collapse of a long-standing nuclear arms control treaty called the INF Treaty, which Trump and Putin both withdraw from. And the third nuclear age is characterized by different things, and it is a bit more complex and unpredictable because of various things that are happening.
Yeah, I understand that it's not a universally agreed idea that we're in this third nuclear age. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so it kind of started out as this academic concept as a way of people like myself to make sense of what's going on. So what scholars and researchers found are that the things that seem to be changing are that we're in an era of what we call multipolarity. So we don't just have two superpowers trying to deter each other or arms racing together. We have three. So we have the rise of China, we've got the US, we've got Russia, who all have sizable nuclear arsenals, and they're now competing in multiple domains, including nuclear. Another characteristic of this third nuclear age is the increased geopolitical tensions that we're seeing around us, whether that's Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Israel's attack on Gaza in response to October 7th, which many states in the ICJ have said is amounts to a genocide. So Israel has nuclear weapons. It doesn't confirm nor deny that, but we're seeing nuclear weapon states increasingly using conflict against their neighbours, and other nuclear weapon states, the relationships between them are deteriorating. So that's another aspect. Other aspects include new technology, AI, hypersonic missiles, all these things that impact long-standing ideas about nuclear deterrence or whatever. And then finally, there's this issue of arms control treaties collapsing. So outside of this meeting, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is going from strength to strength, it nearly has a majority of signatories. Other nuclear arms control treaties, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which meets every year through a series of different meetings of the UN, that's kind of really struggling, right? It's often, every meeting is failing to deliver an outcome document because states can't agree on what's even said at the meeting, and other treaties between the US and Russia, like the INF Treaty, they've collapsed. Russia's withdrawn from the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So yeah, things seem bleak outside of this space.
Yeah, so the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, that's a much older treaty than the TPNW, like signed in 1968 or maybe 1970, depending on what state. But yeah, we are hearing quite a lot here about it being under pressure. Hans Christensen from the Federation of American Scientists said that he knew some top officials in defense in the Trump administrations who had said to South Korea that if they were happy to develop their own nuclear weapons, they would allow them to do that, which would be in breach of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And it's also the UK government that are facing accusations of having breached the NPT because, Article 6 requires states to come to the table, basically, for good faith negotiations.
Yep.
The UK government isn't here, it's refused to take part in this summit. Do you think that they're living up to their obligations under Article 6 of the NPT?
I'm not convinced that they are. And I think the TPNW itself is evidence of the frustration felt by a global majority that the 5 nuclear weapon states who are sort of enshrined the right to have nuclear weapons under the NPT, that they're not keeping up with their obligations under Article 6. So there's a lot of frustration internationally, and that eventually gets to the TPNW, and we can see here that the states parties to the TPNW are using that frustration productively, and they're trying to think about how a specific treaty that bans nuclear weapons, which up until now were the only weapon of mass destruction that didn't have a ban treaty in existence, which is crazy, right? So they're trying to kind of using that frustration productively, and yeah, I think the nuclear weapon states could be doing a lot more to uphold this obligation to disarmament that they've signed up to as part of the NPT.
So the other day, Greta Ostern, who's the editor of the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor, so every year they publish a pretty comprehensive authoritative report on how many nuclear weapons each state has. That was published on Tuesday. As we saw, the US and Russia are miles ahead of anyone in terms of sheer numbers, a hangover from the Cold War. I asked her about the UK government's obligations under the NPT, and she also said that she's not convinced they're upholding it. That's diplomatic language. The UK government did respond. It was after we went to print, after we gave them a deadline, but I do have the response here, so I'm just going to read it out. They said that we remain committed to our obligations under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to pursue negotiations on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament and to achieving a world without nuclear weapons, a transparent, verifiable and irreversible manner with undiminished security for all. And this is the key bit, which is something we do not think is achievable with the TPNW. So that's quite a severe rebuke of the TPNW and all the nations here as well, as I would argue it. What's your response to that? Do you think that that is a fair position for the government to take?
No, not really. I think I'm yet to see convincing evidence that, or reasons why the UK government can't take the TPNW a bit more seriously, or at least engage, whether that be as an observer state, or whether just as a state that just doesn't dismiss the TPNW as something that is irrelevant. Because as we can see here, there is like global momentum to support it. So yeah, various states who aren't part of the treaty have come along to previous meetings of states parties as observer states. There's observer states here who gave statements on the floor yesterday on the UN. And so to Switzerland and the Marshall Islands, for example, they gave statements and they kind of said, hey, we're interested in the work that is going on in this space, but here are the reasons why we can't, what we think needs to be improved before we might sign it. And that's a much more productive way of approaching the treaty, right? So I would love it if the UK could come in. I know Ian Murray recently said that the UK should send a delegation to observe, and I think that would be much more productive, because I think at a time like this, diplomacy is more important than ever before, and I think it's great that the UK take the NPT seriously, or they attend and they they work on things like verification and irreversibility. Like, that's important, but it's also important that they recognise what else is happening. And the TPNW, in my view at least, seems to be going from strength to strength, and should be taken more seriously. And the UK and its allies should attend, right?
So we're hearing from the UK government, from Keir Starmer, and not only from Keir Starmer to be fair, but also like Macron in France, about ideas of actually expanding nuclear weapons, expanding the nuclear umbrella, tensions in Europe, tensions in the Pacific, tensions in the Middle East. They're saying we need nuclear weapons to prevent these escalating. Is that not a fair argument?
I don't think so, because I think if this theory of deterrence fails, the result will be catastrophic. And I don't think we can afford to increase the number of nuclear weapons or double down on this theory of deterrence, which we're still not exactly sure how and exactly why and when it works. Like, there's evidence that it might work in certain circumstances, but if it fails, so if it's not 100% perfect, we're looking at nuclear weapons being used, right? And the science tells us that if a small nuclear war takes place, so if 100 nuclear warheads are detonated in cities in a conflict between two nuclear weapon states, the results would be 2 billion people dying of starvation within 2 years across the planet. Because what would happen, there'd be so much destruction and fire and emissions into the atmosphere through just 100 warheads being used, and that would, starve the planet. And this would have catastrophic effects on civilization. And that's just 100 warheads. There's like 12,000 other these things out there. So a full-scale nuclear war is going to be even more catastrophic. So for me, deterrence, it just doesn't. It's never going to be perfect, and it therefore shouldn't be something that we rely on as a country, as a species, and as a planet, right? And so banning the bomb and taking this on seriously and working towards that seems to be essential to me to survive. We want, our children, our children's children to continue living on this beautiful planet. There can't be nuclear weapons in existence, and there can't be more of them, or we can't be relying on them more, because there's no evidence to prove that they will make the world more stable. The opposite is true. They're probably going to make the world even more unstable. So times like now, times of crisis, require cool heads and cooperation. Right? They don't require more posturing and more standing off against each other.
So cool heads and cooperation. I'm just going to ask you one more question, because that's reminded me of a statement from John Swinney the other day. But we've actually seen this morning our time, that Ian Blackford has called for the SNP to change their policy on nuclear disarmament. The SNP wants to unilaterally remove Trident from Scotland, get rid of their nuclear weapons in an independent country. Ian Blackford is now saying that they should instead sign up to multilateral disarmament treaties, whatever they might be, negotiations. What are the differences there, and what do you think would be the best policy?
I think public opinion is clear that despite what's happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people still don't think nuclear weapons make them safe. So public opinion across Europe, across Scotland and the UK, more people want rid of nuclear weapons than want to keep them. So I think changing that policy might alienate quite a lot of voters, would be harmful electorally, but it would also just be relatively, could be a dangerous position to be in. Like, I think the SNP's long-standing opposition to nuclear weapons is a great policy, and I think that's what SNP members want, and I think that's what the majority of people who want in Scotland want as well. So to me, I don't think it would make sense as a policy shift, but I guess that's up to SNP members and to decide. But it's interesting. So the TPNW is obviously a multilateral space, right? And it's good to see Bill Kidd from the SNP is here, engaging with parliamentarians in support of the TPNW. So yeah, it's good. good to see any and all engagement in disarmament, but the specifics of that, I'll leave that to the SNP members.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. So I don't want to keep you all day, but I feel like I'd be remiss to mention you haven't actually been here at the TPNW for this entire time. I mean, you did leave very briefly on Tuesday. You went to Chicago. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so the International Studies Association was meeting in Chicago, and I'm absolutely delighted and honoured that my recent book, Unparalleled Catastrophe, Life and Death in the Third Nuclear Age, was awarded the Science, Technology and Arts in International Relations Best Book Award. So yeah, I went over there to pick that up, a nice plaque. The book's out in paperback in June, so yeah.
Congratulations.
Very proud, cheers.
Yeah, nothing wrong with the shameless plugs. That was Unparalleled Catastrophe by Dr. Rhys Crilley, and the subheading is Life and Death in the Third Nuclear Age.
That's it. It sort of chronicles this third nuclear age, and starts with the collapse of the INF Treaty, and then runs up, gives an overview of recent history and what that means and where we should go forward.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Dr. Crilley.
Thank you very much.
Use your formal name. And thanks everybody for watching us here in New York and for following all our reporting from the TPNW meeting of state parties this week.